The politicians and the civil servants and the journalists are all the same. They're amateur generalists. None of them have any idea what they're talking about.
Ian Dunt is a political journalist and columnist for The Eye. He's written a book called How Westminster Works and Why It Doesn't. You talk about one man wasting 2.7 billion. Do you think there is large levels of waste?
They'll come in and they're reforming not really because they believe it needs to be done, but because they want to make a name for themselves. So they'll be promoted at the next reshuffle. No politician in any of the parties is prepared to say the actual truth.
I went to number 10, and specifically we were there for a fraud briefing, which was them talking about the fraud problem. And every single politician I said said the exact same fact to me. Like, do you know that 50% of adults, and I was just like, these guys have no idea. Like, they've got this surface level knowledge of this thing. Mm-hmm. And I came away from that thinking, God, these people they don't actually know the topic. They're just like puppets or parrots almost, like rabbiting out this fact. They get one sheet and they read off it. And there was a quote in your book that went something like this. I've got it written down here. It's a handicap faced by all ministers. He didn't know what he was doing. He didn't know what he was doing. Basically, you talk about Chris Grayling at the start, and just the way he essentially went into Parliament with a view of going, I want to change something, and just completely effed up probation. Yeah.
Yeah. The thing about what he did with probation is that he was warned over and over again by the people who understood probation, i.e. trade unions, workers in the service, academic experts, inspectors. They all said the same thing. It's basically like, what you're trying to do here, it's going to be a disaster, and we're warning you right now. You need to stop and think again. And he ignored every single one of them. And he could ignore every single one of them because British politics basically hands a tremendous amount of power to the Prime Minister and to ministers. Much more than you get in the US, much more than you get in European countries. You can kind of do what you want, really. And so he just went ahead and did it. What he did was he privatized probation. He basically just tried to introduce all of these market mechanisms into a system that's really about, you take someone who needs rehabilitating after they've been to prison or as a punishment instead of prison and go, we're like, let's see what we can do with this person. It failed catastrophically. And when I say failed, I mean, people died. That would not otherwise have died.
People got murdered.
Yeah, exactly.
By criminals that should have been in the probation system.
Then the coroner's courts were basically like, we are laying this at the door of what happened with the reforms of probation. So it's really well documented, the consequences of it. But there were no consequences for him, right? Nothing changed in his career. He could walk away, leave it behind. He becomes transport secretary. In fact, he was actually given a more senior position, which he catastrophically messed up in an entirely predictable way when you knew what he did as justice secretary. And not just him. You look at the people that did it in the civil service, right? Like Antonio Romero. She was in charge of that project. Was she punished? No. In fact, she became the permanent secretary. She became like the most senior position in that department. This over and over again is what you see with the British system. There's hardly any chance to stop people exercising their power. And then when they fail, and they do fail, they just go on to be promoted to an even higher position than they started in.
So this is what we're going to explore today, and, kind of why that's the case, and maybe, what people can do about it. Because I think there's never been such a lack of trust in politicians, not in my lifetime anyway. And there's never been such contempt for them. I think, looking at them going, you really don't know what you're doing. You're all a bunch of idiots on every side of it. And it's kind of staggering when I listen to your book to hear the how the system works and how it supports that failure and then promotes upwards and things like this. Another story that you use with Chris is about the boat company that had no boats, or the shipping company that had no ships. I mean, do you want to just say that for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, it was during Brexit, right? And he was preparing for no deal Brexit when they were going to kind of pointlessly just introduce this catastrophic event into the middle of our really quite complex trading networks. And he had to sort out the shipping. One of the companies he got to do the shipping, he spent absolutely enormous amounts of money on this, were so professional that they'd literally never run any shipping, but they also copied and pasted their terms and conditions from a pizza delivery company. Now, that was the extent of the complexity.
That is savage.
But all of it was perfectly visible to see. But then this is the thing. We can focus on him, and it's tempting because he is like a bona fide moron. But that is not the key principle. The key principle is, how on earth is a man like that in that position?
Where's the safeguards?
And where's the accountability? Like, why is there no punishment? It's a bit like the bankers when they do something really bad and then they all get bonuses at the end of the year, and you're like, but you just put us in a recession, or you just like caused this. Why are you getting bonuses? Like, where's the accountability?
They won awards for this probation project.
They did,
right?
the civil service team, yeah.
They won awards for something that was a massive failing in terms of people died, the most vulnerable people in society were not looked after, protected, and society as a whole was put at more risk by basically unleashing the worst of us in terms of criminals onto people without ever checking up on them. There was one example of the guy who murdered a teenager or someone outside of a pub, and basically it was well documented that he became violent if he took cocaine, but then they stopped doing drugs tests.
Yeah.
And I think what you showed in your book was that basically they didn't understand with probation that the reasons for people reoffending are complex, and they put it all down to this very simple kind of idea, and they privatized the system. And the problem with privatization is when you drill down into profits, you tend to strip back a lot of the fluff that actually is really needed in that kind of system. You need the fluff. You need the wider padding, and maybe the things that the public sector get criticized for, which in probation is very complicated.
You're spot on. So, I mean, this is the thing. You can go in, if you have like a really ideological disposition, you're basically just saying, I believe in the free market. You're not really interested in having a conversation about what does the free market do well and what does the state do well, and a more nuanced conversation, right? You just say, I believe in the free market. That's what I believe in. That's the attitude he went in with. You look at probation, like, why do people reoffend? They reoffend because of a galaxy of different reasons, but it's about housing. It's about drug programs. It's about therapy, actually, for dealing with your emotional sort of situations and dealing with conflict in a non-violent way. It's about education. It's about jobs. If you then say, right, we're going to reward you financially if they don't reoffend, and we're going to punish you financially if they do reoffend, it doesn't make any sense, because you can do whatever you like as a probation company. But if they're sleeping in a cardboard box by Waterloo, they are going to reoffend for reasons that you do not have control over. So the market mechanism was completely arbitrary. And as soon as the private companies that he brought in realized it was arbitrary, they were like, okay, well, I can do whatever I want, spend money on these programs. I won't necessarily get any further money. But I do know one thing that will save me money. It's like, if I just start sacking staff, if I just get rid of staff, get rid of buildings, and you just lower the quality of the service. That's what took place. He ended up gutting probation by virtue of not really thinking about his ideological position.
And by splitting it and saying the highest risk people will still be managed by the state, what they essentially did was then put on those people that deal with high risk, only high risk. So their workload went from, I have 5 high risk characters and a load of not so high risk. And the emotional burden of these people are basically just dealing with murderers and rapists constantly, destroyed them. And it meant that everything that hit their desk was critical at all times. So they couldn't go, I'll push back my car theft so that I can deal with this guy who's just murdered a new person or whatever. It's when you spell it out, it shows it's like the ripple effects of these highly complicated things. It can't just be boiled down to economic incentives and money and efficient markets.
Point. And also like the weakness that comes when like you have politicians that are sat there, they think they're like generals in a war pushing these triangles around the map and go, well, it makes sense, right? Free market initiatives, off we go. Unless you talk to people on the ground about service delivery, they can't tell you this stuff, right? They can't tell you the fact that, right, when you used to have all the cases of seriousness mixed up, you'd be like, yeah, okay, so I've got 5, serious sexual assaults, but I can actually spend the afternoon on road traffic offenses. And that's actually just a chance to just decompress. Yeah. And not just be involved in like the worst possible elements of the human experience day after day after day. You would not presume that, right? Unless you know about probation, unless you talk to probation officers, you don't really presume that kind of thing. But as soon as you do, it instantly makes sense that that's the kind of thing that they would need. He just didn't speak to him. And he doesn't speak to them in the same way that you constantly see with ministers, of like just freezing yourself out from evidence and experience.
I think it's really important to focus on the how someone like Chris Grayling can come in. And one thing your book communicates well is that politicians want to do something. They want to just do some shit so that they can be like, look what I've done. And that's their motive. And that might be to rip up something that they have no experience in. You say in your book that there's 4 areas of society that should hold these people to account. The press, I think the Treasury was one, Parliament, what was
Civil service.
The civil service. Why do they fail to do that?
Mostly because they have many of the same defects as politicians. And the crucial defect that politicians have is that they don't know what they're talking about. Okay? And that's systematic. That's not like an accident that took place. Now look at how we pick the MP. You don't pick an MP in an election. Elections don't really matter. We don't really count 2/3 of the votes in an election. We routinely ignore them. 70% of the votes were ignored in 2019. It's really consistent over time. We ignored 71% of the votes in 2010.
When you say ignore, what do you mean?
This is it. So we have first past the post. Only the winner get sent to Parliament, right, in each constituency. So if you voted for anyone that lost, let's say if they even had one vote less than the winner, then your vote was completely lost. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't increase the party's representation. That's 45% of the votes in the last election were for people that lost. The other way you have your vote wasted is if you voted for the person that won after the point that they won. So if you're the next vote after the point of victory, it's called a surplus vote. It achieves nothing. It doesn't increase representation. That was 25% of the votes in the last election. For all of those people, which is usually about sort of 65 to 75% of the country, their votes are completely ignored. The real bit where we select an MP is not really the election. It's when the parties select the candidate. Because whoever that candidate is, if it's a safe seat, they will be the MP. And for the vast majority of seats in this country, you take in the last election, 79 seats changed hands out of 650 of them. We thought of it as this big moment, right? Boris Johnson comes in, everything changes. Well, it wasn't that at all. Hardly any seats, about 12% of seats changed hands. And that's how it is in all elections. The rest are safe seats. Whoever the parties pick to be their candidate in that seat will be the MP. So how do they pick that person? Well, they pick it basically in a closed room with a bunch of officials from the local party deciding who's on the shortlist, and then they put it out to a debate of their local members. Their local members really, in reality, is a few dozen people in a room. Okay? Those people are not representative. They're not representative in terms of age. They're much older than most. They're
50 above.
50 above is the average age, exactly. You really have read the book quite closely. I'm quite troubled by that. I feel like it's like a memory test.
No.
They're not representative in terms of gender. They're overwhelmingly male. They're certainly not representative racially. 97% of the Tory party is white. It's a little bit lower for Labour and the Lib Dems, but basically exactly the same. And they're not representative in terms of their politics. Like, they're really very committed political people. They're ideologues. They're partisans, right? They believe very strongly in one way. So who do they pick? Ideologues and partisans, people that are like them. They don't care about specialist knowledge. They don't care about deep subject domain expertise. They have none of those interests. They don't think who's going to scrutinize the government, who's going to have good ideas. They think, are you the kind of person who goes out on a rainy Sunday to deliver leaflets through mailboxes? That's who I am. And that's who the kind of person is that I want as a candidate. So those people are the ones we get as politicians. And surprise, surprise, they're not the ones that know much about the situations that they're asked to scrutinize or govern.
And this is how you could get someone who it represents a constituency that's never lived there, that's never even been there. They're just plonked there because it's like, that's a safe seat, so you can be the person for that area. And it's like...
That does happen. But the funny thing is that one of the only wrinkles in this is that local party members do care quite a lot about local roots. They don't always get the chance to sort of make their point clear on that. And sometimes these people are parachuted in, but they do care about local roots. So one of the few things they will rebel against the party on is essentially the local character of the candidate.
Yeah, you say that that's their worst nightmare, is coming up against a local candidate, because they tend to win because they're one of us. It's
and they've got the networks. This is the thing, they've got the networks. The other thing we reward apart from partisanship is networking, especially at the central party level. You have these things called special advisors, who are basically selected by ministers to work with them in their job. And those are the people that the leadership usually proposes to local parties to become a candidate. But again, they don't know anything about the situation they're dealing with. They're experts in networking, and they are, believe me, very good at it. Okay, they're very, very good at that. But when it comes to, okay, well, now design us a transport policy, or scrutinize the government when it talks about what it's going to do with, private involvement in the NHS. Well, they don't know anything about these issues.
What? Go on, mate.
I was going to say, from your book, it seemed that you were kind of saying that maybe not most, but a lot of politicians aren't qualified for the jobs that they're in, or they don't have like relevant work experience or background in the position they're in. Do you say like that's most of them?
Hunt was a marmalade salesman, wasn't he? In Japan. He definitely doesn't know anything about the NHS. He was. He sold marmalade in Japan. He doesn't know anything about the NHS and the purse of the UK. Do you know what I mean?
The thing is, that actually makes me admire him more. Because I thought the Japanese were quite into subtle flavours. And marmalades. He's doing a good job,
He's a failed marmalade salesman from Japan. No, joking. Like, the business didn't go anywhere.
Not a marmalade mogul, no.
I mean, we've got Paddington Bear running the country, mate. No, sorry, go on.
So do you think it's the majority of politicians aren't really equipped? Most of them are not.
The overwhelming
don't have the experience for their roles.
100%. Like, the overwhelming majority of them, and don't even really show any interest in it. So on ministers, let's imagine for a moment that one of them did have expertise when they became a minister, right? It doesn't even matter, because they're going to be moved in 2 years anyway. And 2 years, by the way, is me being generous. It used to be 2 years before they moved them. I mean, recently, we had a year during the crossover from Boris Johnson to Sunak with that Truss nightmare in the middle. Well, we had 5 health secretaries in the course of a year. We had 3 education secretaries. I mean, it was just completely out of control. But even in a more reasonable time frame, So you talk to ministers and they'll say this, like the first 12 months, I know nothing. After that, I start to build knowledge. I'm kind of functional and useful at 2 years, which I think is actually kind of a typical job experience. Well, that's when they get moved. So it's almost like the point that you actually know what you're talking about, then they shift you over somewhere else. And then, I mean, to answer the original question that you asked me a million years ago before I started just doing an endless monologue, like, why do they all suffer the same problem? Because it's exactly the same in the civil service. The civil service, you're rewarded for moving as often as possible. So you get crazed rates of turnover. You look at the Treasury. Treasury has a turnover staff rate of a McDonald's. And the same with permanent secretaries. They just move and move and move. Why? Because it's how you get more money. It's how you get promoted. There's no cultural recognition for actually developing some kind of deep specialist knowledge. Instead, they're amateur generalists, just like a great slush of humanities students. They're quite good at picking the right word to paper over a disagreement, but they don't actually know anything about rail contract negotiations, right? And the same in journalism. Journalism, you're just asked to cover how many stories a day now. When I first went into journalism, you might be expected to write one over the course of the day. At least you'd have a chance to understand it. Now I have colleagues who are asked to write 5 to 7 stories a day.
Jesus Christ.
Of course you don't know.
How can you do that?
Well, you just don't know what
Any
you're talking
level
about.
of depth or
Exactly.
make it good.
Exactly. So that's why we failed at scrutiny, because the politicians and the civil servants and the journalists are all the same. They're amateur generalists. None of them have any idea what they're talking about.
But like, why do we give the amateur generalists the power to make massive decisions then?
That's a very good question. I mean, if you
don't
find
know
the
the
answer to that, then please tell me. Like, part of that has to be cultural, right? And part of it's institutional. And I think these things are connected. You build the institution and you get the culture that it demands. What's the institution that we've built in Parliament? It's supposed to be that the MP sits in the Commons and they scrutinise what the government does and vote for it. That's not really true, is it? It's actually the political parties control what goes on in the Commons. You have a whip system. It means that if you're an MP for Labour or the Tories, they will tell you the way that you are going to vote on a piece of legislation. It's not that the MP sits there exercising independent judgment. How do they succeed? Not by scrutinising. In fact, scrutinising would mean that your career is going to go badly wrong. Not by thinking independently about it, but by doing what the party tells you to do. And if that's the institution, if those are the incentives, what do you get? Conformist ideologues who don't know what they're talking about. And that's what we see in front of us on the news every day.
And, we focus on Chris Grayling and you got it's all right, everyone does it. You got a whole chapter on him. But what I want to hammer home here is that this is widespread. So how common do you think these sorts of mistakes are within the system?
Oh, God. I mean, have you seen the country?
Yeah.
I mean, which bit of it looks like it's working?
Not the trains, not the NHS
This
too
table's
well.
pretty sturdy.
Yeah,
It's all right.
This table's all right. This table's doing better than any government department.
Tables from China.
shine now.
But like, which bit, right? I mean, is it the prisons? No, they're completely crammed full. They're falling apart. Is it the education system with classrooms falling in on kids? Like there is no part of
it's
it.
not healthcare.
It's not
Exactly.
housing. It's not housing. It's
certainly not
Even the
housing.
tax system's a mess.
The tax system is actually the most horrific, arguably the most horrific mess of all.
Yeah.
So I mean, no, it's all a failure. And the reason for that is because of the kind of people and the kind of incentives that we put on them.
So how have we become such a successful country with all of this backwards political structure and system? Like I know Italy has a few issues in their parliament and that sometimes they like to throw their fists around. But I mean, it doesn't seem like other countries are so complicated in like tax, in like the government, with politicians. How have we gotten so far with such a messed up political system?
We stole everyone else's resources when we had a navy.
Well, there is the Victorian period, obviously, and all that involves. I think there have been certain periods, I'm thinking more in our lifetime now rather than, Gladstone or whatever, but where we have actually had people that have succeeded in making Downing Street in particular work for short periods. I'm thinking particularly of the second Blair term. First Blair term, they kind of wasted. The third Blair term was just this kind of civil war with Gordon Brown in it and nothing was achieved. But the second term, they set up these units in Downing Street that started to coordinate, that used academic expertise. And that's the period that we look at where we're like really, really striking reductions in NHS waiting times, in literacy and numeracy rates in education, in train times in the autumn. Most of it just developed by having a completely non-Westminster view. Like the usual Westminster attitude is you basically walk around like this massive kind of macho ego, and it's like, you're going to do what I'm going to do, or else, I'm going to visit your mother and kill her and wear her skin as a mask to your political funeral, and just the rah-rah bollocks, of the thing. Are we allowed to swear in this podcast?
Yeah.
I've already done it.
I think this is the one topic where you can definitely swear.
It kind of came out before I knew.
It's all right.
And that's usually the culture. At that point, you had a guy that went into Downing Street called Michael Barber, and he just had a really different attitude. He just wasn't tribalistic. He was kind of academic and curious. This thing was just, I just want to ask you questions about stuff. He used to have this attitude towards negotiations, which is, his principles were, you will say what needs to be said, but you will leave the relationship in a better place than it was when you began the conversation, which is actually, like, I think to conduct yourself in work is like a really good set of principles. And they managed to improve things. And after a while, that unit system fell away. And what you got was kind of governments you've seen recently, where they're just like, you can tell that they don't know why things are happening. They'll say things like, we're going to improve policing, we're going to improve NHS, and they pull these levers in Downing Street. They're like, the lever doesn't work, because it's really complex. Like, to try and sort out things like NHS waiting times, you've got to have the Treasury there, you've got to have all sorts of government departments, you've got to have communication between the centre and the department, and then you're going to have manageable, workable goals that get you towards a 3 to 4 year benchmark for what you're trying to achieve. That's really hard, and it requires concentration. And it's especially hard if you're in politics, and every day there's a new scandal, there's a new row, there's a new war, there's a new recession that distracts your attention away from the things you promised you would achieve. So when we have accomplished things in the modern period, I'd say it's because you've got these moments of serious-minded people creating serious-minded institutions that could do serious things, but they didn't last long.
Here's the thing, there's only really a few ways you can boost your income. I mean, you could change job, but the other main route is to start building a business or a side project. That's how my YouTube channel began, alongside my day job and delivering Chinese takeaways. If you've started or want to start a side project, then you'll need a website. Now, I like Hostinger because of their AI website builder. It's really easy to use and it's great value for money. You can spin up a website just like that. You just have to describe what you would like your website to look like, and Hostinger's AI generates a professional looking site in seconds. Their AI is really impressive. You can ask it to create things like SEO friendly copy, a logo, and they've got an AI heat map to predict user behavior as well. Hostinger is perfect for side projects, e-commerce brands, or portfolios. You can get a website up and running plus a free domain for £2.99 a month, and if you use the code MAKINGMONEY, you'll get an extra 10% off. That's one word, making money, and there's a link in the description for you. There's one example of, and you point it out in your book, and I look at their research quite a lot, where they do hold the politicians to account. That's the OBR.
OBR's great.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about, I think this is a good example of how we can kind of, through the incentives, we can turn the incentives back on the politicians.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Spot on. So and you have other instances of this. You have select committees, you have different areas. And you can even say Institute for Fiscal Studies does a similar thing with the Treasury, just these bodies that will scrutinize what government does and therefore improves it. OBR's creation of George Osborne, he'd had ages in opposition to think up what to do, and he kind of wanted it as an attack on Labour for sort of fiscal spending. But it became a straitjacket on the government and the Tory government, which basically instead of saying each budget, we as the Treasury get to tell you how the economy's doing, which seems mad that we ever did it that way once you change it. They're like, no, we're going to have an independent body that will tell you how it's going. So every time we have a budget, we had one not so long ago, and you just sit there and you basically wait for the Chancellor to stop talking because you're like, yeah, whatever. Please just show me the OBR report. just show me the numbers, okay? Because that's the reality of where we're going. You could see, evidence of this. Do you remember, during the Brexit period, you would always have, because Sunak was a Brexiter, he would never want to mention Brexit in the budget. It got to this most preposterous point. It really didn't matter whether you were a Leaver or a Remainer. It was literally, I think it was 24 days away from Brexit happening, and he did a budget where he didn't mention it. You're just like, you need to mention it. There's obviously an effect here. And so as if it didn't exist, and you open up the OBR document, and the OBR document was like, okay, we're going to have a problem here, by the way. We're going to have a problem with investment, with trading, with blah, blah, blah. This is how we calculate it. So you get a dose of reality into the fantasy unicorn land of government communication.
Yeah, where they can just ignore like the biggest change in the way the economy is going to be structured in a lifetime, whereas the OBR will come out and go, this thing right here is a big concern. There's loads of uncertainty within the economy, blah, blah, blah.
Exactly, which is why they now want to get rid of it, right? Like Sunak started briefing against it after exactly that budget. Then you had Liz Truss come in. Liz Truss, of course, completely sidelined it.
Well, they ignored the OBR report, didn't they, for the mini budget? They said, we don't want it.
They just wouldn't involve them in the process at all, which is part of the reason that the markets panicked so badly, because they're like, well, you're marking your own homework all of a sudden, and you look like you're a lunatic. So like you more than anyone, we want to have someone marking your homework. And now you see the attacks again. Like you see it from Jacob Rees-Mogg, you see it from conservative backbenchers going, the OBR, and actually Liz Truss doing her speeches in the US. The OBR is kind of part of the deep state, the blob, this kind of bizarre Tory conspiracy, where it's like, well, they're restraining the will of the people, whatever. These attacks are because people that have had power and have power typically hate it when that power is restrained. And generally speaking, the extent to which they are attacking it is an indication of the fact that it's working pretty well.
Yeah, we should champion these organisations that will say, no, this is the ramifications of whatever you're saying.
I'm going to organise like the most boring demonstrations on the street of all time. Be like, what do we want? Proper scrutiny by the Office of Budget Responsibility.
When do we want it? When do we want it? Now.
Every quarter. Yeah, and then you talk of the Treasury as an organisation that kind of was that, but kind of might not be now. And I think for this topic and this podcast and the money and the tax, and that's where we should have a look. So did it used to be that and now it isn't, or?
Yeah, Treasury is a beast of a thing. It's an incredible department. I mean, it's certainly the most powerful restraint on the Prime Minister that exists in our system. Okay, so much more powerful, obviously, than the monarchy, much more powerful than Parliament. I mean, much more important and much more of a restraining force on the Prime Minister than Parliament. And arguably, you could say, certainly it's sometimes more powerful than the Prime Minister themselves. And you see that in the kind of people that you get around the Prime Minister. So May changed this. He went for security people. But until Theresa May, every time you had like the Cabinet Secretary, the most senior position in the Cabinet, that was selected by the Treasury. They pick who goes there. And you get the Principal Secretary in Downing Street. That's the person who, literally the human being, including their family, who spends the most time with the Prime Minister all the time. That person was selected by the Treasury. They would basically have Downing Street in a headlock. Why? Because they've got the money. And whoever has the money ultimately has the power. That has been the story of British politics throughout. It's how we became a democracy, because Parliament had control over taxes and the King didn't. And that's now transferred to the Treasury. And inside of that really bullish, strong culture was also the fact that they told the other departments what to do. They don't just come up with the financial policy for themselves. Other departments, whether they have one project or for their yearly spending limits, go to the Treasury to get sign-off. So the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, that second minister there, is the one that sits there for bilaterals. One of the former people in the Treasury role said that their job was basically to beat up their colleagues, leaving, quote, the minimum visible bruising. That's the process of just being like, no, show me how this makes sense financially. So they're incredibly powerful. And inside of the Treasury, you have this, even now, although less so than before, really vivacious intellectual culture of the sort that you barely see in British politics, where it's a lot of conformist, quite obedient types who don't know much. In the Treasury, you get people who knew considerably more, and they'd be willing to have big, fiery debates in front of their minister. That would be the way it was with Norman Lamont. That would be the way that it was with Ken Clarke, these really big beast old Tory chancellors. And really, that only changed when Gordon Brown went into the Treasury.
Don't you think that this is a bit ridiculous, because we have some of the, I just can't get my head around it. We've got some of the best universities in the world. Like we've got Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, we've got great schools. How do we not have geniuses in Parliament? Like, how can there be an excuse that, oh, I don't have experience in this, or we're not smart enough to figure this out? Like, we have a choice of some of the most highly educated people in the world. Mm-hmm. Why are they not all politicians?
The funny thing is, we do have really smart people as long as they studied humanities. Where we lose out is hard sciences. And we have had that problem really since, in 1968, there was a report, particularly in the civil service, called the Fulton Report. Basically said, this is the issue that we have. And we have exactly the same problem now. Now, you look at the people that secured the vaccine during COVID, the reports that came out from them are exactly the same. They're just like, we just really lack any kind of deep domain knowledge. We've got humanities students, we don't have maths and sciences, we don't have statistics. The reason for that is primarily financial. So if you're a humanities, and I say this as a humanities student, right? Like, if you're a humanities student, you won't necessarily make that much more money than you would in the civil service out of uni. But if you want to go into the financial sector, you will make a lot
If you're
more
an
money.
economist or something like that, you can earn millions. Yeah.
And even if you're a moderately successful person in the financial sector, you're going to make more probably than a permanent secretary at the absolute height of a department in the civil service. So we have a major financial counter incentive when it comes to higher sciences students that we've failed to address over and over. And the way to address it is money.
Pay more people.
Pay more people, yeah. And there's different ways of doing that. There's different ways of rewarding. You can reduce headcount, but ultimately you need it. And there is a recognition actually with Labour now, because they're basically all civil servants in Labour. It's basically, we're about to get a civil service government, that we have a problem there. We have a lack of institutional knowledge when it comes to contract negotiation, when it comes to any kind of negotiation with the private sector. We're going to have to try and bring those skills in-house rather than contracting them out to consultants at eye-watering day rates, to a way that's basically just completely shafted the taxpayer for the last 20, 30 years.
Let's talk about that then, because I've got a friend who's a doctor, and he was in hospitals when COVID happened, and he said that he got a 19-year-old person from one of the big 4 accountancy firms placed with him on a day rate of 400 a day, just following him around to gauge, what needed to be part of the app, basically. So, and he said every hospital in the country had one of these guys in them. And there's billions and billions of money spent on the app and things like this. And these figures we get thrown around, a lot of it's on this consultants. And there was a report that said that we were addicted to consultancy within. Why is that the case? Why do we lean so hard on?
Because we lost the institutional knowledge of how to do this stuff, and we just thought, well, we just get it on a day rate. We thought that was cheaper, and it isn't. And the funny thing is, the accountancy firm, all of these firms, the consultancy firms, they hire from the same talent pool as the civil service. It's basically bright young things out of university. It's what we used to do with the fast track scheme for the civil service. You just think, you look really smart, do some tests, do well, okay, we're going to see how quickly we can get you through the departments. The thing is that they take them, and instead of turning them into amateurs, instead of setting a sort of system that says, well, you've got to move as quickly as possible, they say, well, no, we're going to turn you into a specialist in this really tiny kind of thing. Okay? Whether it's sort of say like rail franchise negotiation or something, or project management. And project management, we're so weak on project management in civil service, it's unbelievable. So they just say, right, so we're going to train them up there, and then we just lease them back to the government for 3 to 4 times what it would cost for the same amount of time to have someone who was just permanent staff. But you don't only pay 4 times as much, you also lose out, because every time we hire these people, we do not have the skills in-house. We lose it for the future. So now at this point, there are reports that basically say, like, the UK government it's not an intelligent customer. It cannot deal with any kind of private sector initiative, which it must, whether it's for sort of apps or whether it's for, negotiating on transport networks. You need to have that kind of institutional knowledge, and we have hemorrhaged it by lack of long-term strategy.
So I got an example of that on the ground level. One of my mates is a tree surgeon, and for HS2, he just basically said, we just charge them 4 times the market rate. And I said, yes. Christ. And he's like, every single person on the project is doing that. And they were just like, yeah. And he was like, we just, you just rip the government off.
But that's wild. Like, surely, like.
And no one checked, what's the market rate for a tree surgeon? You call upon another firm and be like, I want my tree cutting down, mate.
Yeah.
What's the price?
That's what I'm thinking. Like,
hello, I'm the government. I've got lots of money and I would like a tree cut down, please.
Yeah. Like, anything you look at, you're like, okay, let me get some quotes. Let me compare the market. Let me see what's going to give me the best service and at the best price. So why doesn't the government do what everyone else does? If you're going to buy a car, you don't just go, oh, I'll buy that car. You can look around, you compare, you're like, oh, this model, benefits, features. So why are they just paying 4 times the amount instead of doing a bit of due diligence like everyone else does?
They should get it at a better price because they've got work at scale. They should be like, we can give you work for 5 years.
Exactly.
So they have that process. I mean, you actually have to sort of put forward your business case for why you're doing it and so somewhere along the line, something went wrong with that process. The trouble is that you're constrained in a way that a normal customer isn't. Like if I decide that I'm going to get the tree chopped down, I can basically do it. I don't have to do it. I can decide, okay, fine, so I'm going to not do it right now because the prices are too high, or I can go look for other people. If you're a government that said, we are about to do an HS2 line, you do have to do it. Like, it has to take place. So you then
well,
lose.
It doesn't.
So, is it? Right. Until you change your policy pointlessly in the middle of a conference for no reason at all, it has to be done. And at that point, you basically lose some of the maneuverability you have as a customer. So some of that is hard to prevent, but the rest of it is due to lack of institutional knowledge.
Don't you feel that all the decisions be made in the Treasury in London for the whole country? They don't really look at the whole country. They might not have experience in Manchester, Durham, like other parts of the country. So Is that part of the problem?
It is a bit, the Treasury has a very specific problem when it comes to investment outside of London, which is, it's basically what is a cost benefit analysis. Like you look at a cost, but this is one of the very few podcasts I'm allowed to talk about this stuff, by the way. You guys have made a terrible mistake here. I mean, like, usually everyone, as soon as I say the Treasury, they're like, oh Christ, here it comes.
We're all over that.
We're about the money.
So look, if you have a cost benefit analysis, what are you going to do? If someone talks about building a new road or, broadband resources or rail or whatever, you're going to say, well, okay, so where's the area with the most productivity? Because that's where you're going to get the most benefit by facilitating transport, facilitating communications. If that's your only calculation, what do? You put all the money into London because that's where there's the most existing productivity. For you to say, right, we want to build outside of London, for instance, actually, as we were doing with HS2 until Sunak scrapped the whole thing, you have to have a different calculation, which is not, okay, cost benefit is not the ultimate decider. We want to have an industrial strategy, a national communications strategy, basically a leveling up strategy that says these things matter, these areas matter in their own terms, and our economy will do better overall once we start investing in them. So their problem really was that the Treasury for years, for decades actually, had a very, very narrow view of the basis upon which you would do investment. And it's only recently, they've got a new green book to guide civil servants, it's only recently that they've improved. But even though the Treasury has now improved, the politicians aren't really taking any opportunities that have been given to them.
Yeah, I live up north and I can tell you that nothing's improved in that sense.
Yeah.
Like there is certain investment and you see certain bits, but I come down here and I'll see projects that are going on and I'm thinking, they've basically taken something that was fine and made it a little bit more fine down here and probably spent $1 billion.
Yeah.
Okay, and then how much does the system suffer from a short-term perspective?
Oh God, I mean, it defines what it does. Because what else can you do if you have ministers there for 2 years? There's a point when they did universal credit, which is in sort of the parliament between 2010 and 2015. It was a coalition government. And there was loads of warnings about universal credit. They're basically just like, look, you're a bunch of people that are used to having a regular income each month and you're a rational sort of economic actor. And lots of the people that you're dealing with do not have those advantages. Like they can't afford, for instance, if you say we're going to wait for another 2 weeks before the payment, those 2 weeks will just destroy them. Everything is hand to mouth at a bit of the time. And they're not great at evaluating their finances. So you're going to mess this up and you need to consult much more widely. And again, just like grailing with probation, all of the warnings came exactly to pass. During that period, Lord Freud said he was in charge of part of it. And he just looked around and he thought like, hang on a minute, I have become the institutional knowledge of this project. Like you were having civil servants that moved through that project about once, every 9 months, go on to something else. The whole thing took, years, took like up to 7 years. So he was basically just looking at like the 8th person that was in charge of the project. And you're just like, no, of course, the whole thing's falling apart because nobody knows anything. There was one person there who had actually been following the whole thing from beginning to end. And that's obviously completely short-termist. You would never have an organization to say that we're encouraging people to leave projects before they're done. Actually, encouraging it to happen rather than tolerating it from happening. And that kind of basis gives you these very short-term outcomes. What is this massive red button doing? Is that just, is it like if I say something wrong or forget my
we don't know what you're on about.
I did want,
you're doing well.
Okay, that's good.
I did want to hit it for what's an OCB?
OBR.
OBR, there you go.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I was going to hit it for them, but you guys were deep in. What is an OBR?
Office of Budget Responsibility.
Thank you. But you were just deep in it, so I was like, if I hit it, he's going to get scared.
Yeah. So there was a good example of this that I saw on Netflix about American policy and the relationship they have with China, and they had a government that was focused on building a positive relationship with China. They did that over a long period of time. China is about relationships. I mean, the world is about them. But they made a lot of headway. And then a new political party came in and they were like, do you want to talk about the Chinese relationship? And they were like, fuck that. We don't want to talk. We don't want to know anything. So they walked into the room with China. And the thing about China is, because of their setup, they have very consistent leadership, very consistent. They know the room. Whereas these new guys walk in who've not even had a handover and go, what's all this about then? And the Chinese were just like, oh, forget this. We can't be bothered. So that short-termism and almost the fact that they're pitted against each other means that they don't transfer. They're incentivized to not pass information over to the other side because they want them to look bad. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, there's some truth to that. So like it's least pertinent for us anyway. It's different with the Americans, but in foreign policy, it's because Labour and the Tories, I mean, they like to pretend that they have very different foreign policies, but it's pretty similar, really, like overall. One of them's not going to come along and say, I feel differently about Putin. The Americans don't get that thing because apparently one of the parties has now become pro-Putin. So that's a whole other problem for them to deal with right now. But in Britain, that's not the situation that we're in, thank Christ. When it comes to national projects, I mean, HS2 is that classic example of it, really. Although even in HS2, it's not a good example because that's basically the Tories cancelling a project that they had spent 13 years on themselves. So it's not even the perfect example. What you often get is people swapping the policy out between parties. And that is a problem for democracies in general. That is an issue that it's quite hard to get past. One of your solutions for it is a really good civil service that is just there to try and make sure there's consistency between the parties, especially on infrastructure spending, because you just don't want to start cancelling bridges, halfway through. And the rest of the time, you will see changes. Now, one of the people in the book talks about in teaching. It's basically when, the question was asked, like, what would be the ideal thing? This is a teacher. What would be the ideal thing for you in schools? They're just like, just leave it alone. Like, I'm just begging you for once to just for like 5 years, just leave it alone and just let everything settle.
Stop reforming constantly.
Stop reforming, yeah. Especially because you often the ministers don't really know what they're doing. So they'll come in and they're reforming not really because they believe it needs to be done, but because they want to make a name for themselves. So they'll be promoted at the next reshuffle. So they want to do it very fast. It means they don't really want to listen to much criticism. They don't want to run any pilot projects. Just get it done. We saw that, with sort of part privatization of the NHS in the early part of the coalition. We see it with project after project after project. And that's where the really, really quite dangerous lack of long-term strategy takes over.
But okay, and then on the other side, so we talk about cancelled infrastructure projects. They cancelled HS2 and Rishi stands there and goes, I'm going to take the money, I'm going to invest it in the north. And then he starts listing off all these places he's going to build train stations. And everyone in the north, like, you've said you're going to build that 5 times and you've cancelled it.
Yep.
I think it was either Bradford or Bolton who had the same train station to them, promised 5 times, and it's being scrapped 5 times. Why can they lie? Why can a politician lie?
That's a journalism question. Because ultimately the consequence of a politician lying has to sit with journalists. It can't be, it's not, we can talk about like, we'll bring in the police, but it's a nonsense. It's never going to work that way. And it can't really. It has to be journalists. And journalism has some really severe failures at the moment that are at least as bad as what goes on in politics or in the civil service. Part of it is just not properly holding them to account. Part of it is just really short-term memory. And the rest of it is the fact that there's a very difficult situation when it comes to sources, I think the clearest example of this came when Dominic Cummings had, his Barnard Castle thing in the middle of COVID. Yeah. And you saw, if you look at the first few days of that story, you saw very prominent journalists just holding back. And the reason they were holding back was because they got lots of their stories from Dominic Cummings. Mm-hmm. So there's a real danger, and your personal journalistic integrity has to be about making sure that you do not allow yourself to be seduced by your requirement and by the depth of your contact with that source. But very often that is not what happens. People are dependent on particular sources and they don't want to go on the attack. And part of that can mean that we don't properly scrutinize people when they are lying.
That's why I love YouTube, because they invited me down and they're like, would you like to do more of this? And what they're basically saying is we give you access, but you need to send the videos to us to review. And I did it once and a load of creators did it once and all the creators are just like, no, I'm all right now. Like, I can say what I want in my own platform and you can't control it. And a million people a month watch my YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. So that's a big outlet. And I might not be first to the post. I might not be the best journalist in the world, but I can call out anyone and they can't do anything about it. Yeah. And I think that's powerful, and I hope that improves journalism.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you said, where with the probation issue, out of all the stories in that time written about probation, some of them were like Lindsay Lohan in America doing something like, those are the stories of press writing, but they weren't writing about what was going on in England. Do you think that still goes on as well? Like, it's not a sexy story. They cancelled this. I don't want to talk about it because it's not going to get me clicks or it's not going to get me attention. Is that going on as well?
We're obsessed with the new thing, like whatever the new policy is, So for instance, like take immigration. I mean, we've had so many failed immigration policies, but if you just take Rwanda, we talk a lot about the Rwanda policy right now because it's the new thing that they pass. Once that thing passes, people will just try and forget about it. It's as if it never happened. So you could go back, just 18 months ago, we had the Illegal Migration Act. Before that, we had another act. These things have completely catastrophically failed when it came to asylum, but no one even talks about it. If it's in the past, it's as if it never took place. Then there's all the areas that we just don't bother to look at. probation is classic. Like if you're walking home and someone mugs you for your wallet, that was not just some chance event that took place. That is a failure, typically, of probation, of the prison system. It affects us, but we act like it doesn't. We act like when journalists sit down and think, what do people care about? They think they care about schools and the NHS and police. These are the things that they care about. And you talk about probation, they're like, no one knows what probation is. No one cares. And even if we want to talk about what's happening in it, we first of all need to explain how it works. And you will often, if I sit there, I've had it with news editors and I've had it with producers in studios on radio and TV programs. So they're just like, don't like this word. What is this word, probation? It's just like, that's not, what do we really want to talk about in a politics show? We want to talk about, this Tory MP, Lee Anderson said something unbelievably goddamn stupid over here. So now we're going to have a row. And then Gary Lineker tweeted that he's an idiot. And now we're going to talk, everyone knows that. That's colorful and it's quick and it doesn't require any research. We're basically like sugar rush children in journalism. Like we just want the sugar rush of the now and the immediate and the personal and the brightly colored. And the stuff that actually matters to people's lives in this country goes largely undiscussed.
Are you not scared that we're heading towards where America is, where it's all about sensationalism and
I think we're there,
and the characters of in the politics, and Trump said this and I can't believe he said that, and all these like rumors and gossip and news? Superficial, very superficial things.
I think the answer is definitely yes. No one in this country that I'm aware of is as bad as Trump, I don't think. Like I wouldn't even say, like Farage or Richard Tice, basically the guys running reform on the closest comparison. They're just not as bad as him, as venal, I think, or as dangerous. But in general, you look at you look at someone like Lee Anderson, or you look at like Nadine Dorries, she was media secretary, for God's sake, like a few years ago. She's now writing books about made up conspiracies, which are really not even a step removed from just lizard people gibberish. Just absolute conspiracy theory madness. So on that basis, like you look at Lee Anderson and Nadine Dorries, they are no more stupid than your average sort of like MAGA, hat-wearing lunatic American politician. We're basically operating at a pretty similar intellectual level. The thing is, we just don't have a talisman that's quite as appalling as Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So we had Paul Johnson sit there. And
brilliant.
Yeah,
that's very good.
He's a great guy.
Shit, you should have just got him back, not him, me.
No.
Waste of time.
No, I think your side of the debate's important, because he said that he didn't think within the political system or within the tax system that there's enough waste that's meaningful. As in, yes, there's some waste, but it's not really going to move the needle if we stop that waste.
For reforming,
basically politicians aren't spunking that much money away in terms of, but I think he deals in the B's and T's, like billions and trillions, and maybe to him the numbers aren't that massive. But, you talk about one man wasting 2.7 billion. Do you think there is large levels of waste within government?
So basically our decision-making basis for when we do spending is quite badly flawed. Now, this is supposed to be the thing that the Treasury does more than anything. Just say yay or nay to individual projects, right? So you look at probation, like how in the name of God does it get past the Treasury? Like how? But it does. And yet there's other areas where they crack down on stuff that you just think like, why would anyone be cracking down on this? So, for instance, like when it comes to like lost schooling during COVID, like we have really good data on what that means. We have it from other countries on teacher strikes, on extreme weather events. We can almost calculate in terms of test scores, like not only how much lower the test score will be per pupil by each day lost in school, but we can almost calculate to the pound how much lower their lifetime salaries will be by virtue of what they lost in school. Someone like a kid that lost half a year because of COVID in school will probably over the course of their life earn £40,000 less. Okay, and once you add it up, especially to what that costs to the country.
Times it by a few million kids, it's a lot.
Well, exactly, because it's 30. By the time that we get to 2030, anyone in their 20s will have lost education during that period. We're talking about like a massive cohort that will work their way through the economic system. So every country realized it. They had the data to address it. Countries like the Netherlands spent 2,500 per kid. The US, I think, spent 1,800. Red warning flag on that, but it was around that level. We spent 500 quid. And just basically, again, you get all the experts, they will tell you, we have the data, we need to do the spending here. And the Treasury just basically did the thing where it does, where it just goes like, well, we just don't really believe that this works and we're going to keep the purse strings tight. So the funny thing is with the Treasury decision making is sometimes they make the right call, like furlough, it's the right call, it had to be done at the time. But very often what you find is like the probation on one hand and the catch up schooling, budget on the other, just being like, you seem to be authorizing stuff that doesn't make sense and keeping too tight on things that really has a very strong evidential base.
And you, in your book, you talk about like this reliance on gut feeling amongst key decision makers, and that just seems like a terrible idea.
Especially those guys.
Yeah. It kind of, like I said at the start, it makes you so angry reading your book, but it's very validating because you do sit there as a Joe public and go, does anyone know what the hell's going on here? And I mean, is the people that know what's going on? Is there some hope in this system?
No, nobody knows what's going on. But that really matters. Like, I really do. We have a British thing of just somewhere we just think there's someone in a double-breasted suit who's just
taking care of it.
Exactly, yeah. They are not.
Do you think it's like imposter syndrome? Do you think a lot of politicians are like, I can't believe I'm a politician. Like, how did I get here? And they're like, oh, well, back to work. And then they literally don't know what they're doing.
There's like a really good quote, actually, even if I say it myself, from Nick Clegg in that book, where he's basically just like, it's just crazy. It's like, now I'm deputy prime minister and I'm just doing this stuff. And then it just kind of happens, and we're like, oh, there's a change in the welfare system now. I think most politicians have that sort of thing. They're just like, I just can't understand how I'm being left to do this stuff. But they are.
You spoke about the pandemic a second ago. Can we come back to that? And what did the pandemic show you about, government spending? You mentioned furlough was done well, or you've agreed with it, but...
Yeah, exactly. Or it basically had to be done. I mean, whoever was in charge, they would have done the same thing. And look, when you look at PFI, I don't like it as a case study, and I don't. Right, I beg your pardon. And you know what? I even used the wrong words anyway.
Oh, there you go. I knew it. That's why I was like, I should know what this is.
It's not a private finance initiative. That's not what I'm talking about. So when you look at like the commissioning of the equipment that we used in the health service, the masks and the gowns and the blah, 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 I don't really like using it as an example because it was really badly done and we wasted a lot of money. Was it corrupt? There was an element of intimacy. And the reason I'm being quite political about this.
There's a good word for this. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Because in that situation, this is why. It's an emergency situation. You're having to move quickly. And I do kind of get that there would have been scenarios in that where you're like, would you know someone who does this stuff and can get it up to scale in time? And once that happens, you're messed up. The reason I'm trying to stay away from the word corrupt is because there's an element of intent. You know what I mean? Of like, you're really going in there. So some of the business people were undoubtedly unable to provide and were charging anyway. From the political angle, I think it was comparatively rare that you had someone just thinking this is a get rich quick thing for my mates. Although I'm not going to rule out that some of that took place. So look, it was not a great example, but I have to say COVID always seems like the least fair example for me to use in any number of ways, just because it was such an emergency, high octane situation. The point where the COVID things becomes more difficult is when you get into like 2021, and the decisions that are being made, 18 months into the pandemic, which really hadn't improved in terms of how we passed laws, in terms of the commercial decisions that we made, and in terms of school catch up. That's the bit that I think is harder to forgive rather than the first 6 months, 12 months.
Okay, how about Brexit then as a decision that was brought to the public and the management of that?
Yeah, well, it was unbelievably badly managed. I mean, it would have been hard for any government at all, but it was very, very badly managed throughout. And what it resulted in really was actually this sort of active de-skilling of the civil service. It's quite a mad effect that Brexit had. No one really talks about it. We talk about the bit, and we should do, where it completely destroyed our economy and our sort of state in the world. All of that took place. But something else weird happened in the civil service, which is basically like after austerity, we froze the headcount. And we said, well, the only way for you to get more money is for you to get a promotion. We're not going to just start giving anyone pay rises. So you couldn't hire anyone in from outside, and the only way to get a pay rise was to move within the service. And then we did Brexit. Brexit basically meant we needed to massively level up government capacity. The only real leveling up that followed Brexit was in the civil service, because you had to just create new departments. You had to create the department for leaving Europe. You look at DEFRA, the environment department. Like basically that thing was hardly had anyone in it because Europe did all of that stuff. Now we're like, oh Christ, we're going to do the environmental regulation, so we better hire a bunch of people. But you couldn't. So instead they just had all the people that were in the civil service and they just put them into the most senior positions imaginable when they were about, 21 years old, really young. So I'm speaking to one person in the Treasury who was basically going in for the conversation with like an incredibly senior figure in the Department for leaving the EU. And they were just like, well, this is a child. You've put me in a room with an actual child right now. But they had to do it because of the impact of Brexit and austerity before it. So one of the weird elements of Brexit that we don't really talk about is the fact that our civil service was deprofessionalized even more severely than it had been in the years leading up to it.
And, just the decision to bring Brexit to the country and David Cameron's motives in that, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so he made that decision on the basis of a local election campaign that none of us can even remember now. And that's the funny thing. He had a threat from UKIP on his right flank. He thought, well, okay, so I'll make this, this promise to my backbenchers, try to stop them defecting over to Nigel Farage's party. And we can't even remember that local election. I literally can't even remember what the results were in the local election that concerned him. And then he makes the speech. And what the result of that speech is he, less importantly, destroyed his own career. That part was actually quite enjoyable. Although even he's back now.
He's back now, the saviour.
It's like literally like a plumbing system that simply will not work. And then our country kind of gets debilitated, not just economically, but I think also politically. We entered into a kind of tribal mania that has largely ended now. But for a while, we just all really, really hated each other.
Oh, yeah.
Which is not helpful.
Definitely.
And on the basis of what? So one guy making a calculation on his own electoral tactics. Like, why allow a prime minister to even have that much power in the first place? But over and over again, we do. The crucial fact is we act like the prime minister is quite a modest figure compared to the US. The US president can barely do anything. Like, they are massively restrained by the electoral cycle and by Congress in the US, probably over restrained, to be honest. Like, in Britain, they can do whatever they damn well please. The reason for that is our electoral system. Like, you take that first past the post electoral system, whoever wins, it hands them a massive majority in the Commons. So who can stop them? Like, they will bring forward a legislation and we will talk about it and the news will go on about it and MPs will do big speeches. It doesn't make a blind bit of difference because if you have a majority in the Commons, you can pass whatever legislation you want. They can act without scrutiny. They can act with impunity. And when they can do that, they tend to behave in the way David Cameron did when he called that referendum and thinking, this happens to be useful for me in the short term. Bugger the consequences. And it turns out that the consequences were very severe indeed.
Yeah. And what do you think the solution to that is?
The solution is going to come through a Labour government and it's going to be very slow and it's not going to make anyone particularly happy and it's not going to be theatrical, but it will be real. So we've already heard from Labour. I mean, Remainers, like myself and my colleagues and my friends and politically everyone I know, like the parody of myself that I am in North London, thinks, well, we want you to be this big Remainy fighter. That's what we want from Starmer. And he's never going to be that because he's got to keep an electoral coalition together. However, he has said things that are much more radical than people really realize. He says we want alignment on agriculture and even they're saying on industrial goods. What alignment means, it sounds technical, but it isn't. It's like, well, we're going to share law and rules, which is kind of the beating heart of the whole question, really. Saying
we can make our own rules, but we're just going to take their rules.
Do yours.
Because they're going to make us take theirs. We're not going to dictate that. It's like we toe their line.
Of course, because they're bigger. That's how it works. We gave up our seat at the negotiating table. So the alternative is either get poorer or accept that those are the rules that people trade on. Yeah. Because surprise, surprise, if the EU says you have to have USB-C sockets on mobile phones and Britain says, actually, we want the original USB, then manufacturers are going to make it for the European market because there's more of them there. Yeah. It's as simple as that. But then there's another weird bit to this, which is that Starmer is bringing forward Biden's economic policy, which is a kind of America first policy. It was basically to say, Biden's thing was essentially, what if Trump, but progressive? So we're going to build things in the US. The things that we want to build are like electric vehicles, the kind of things that liberals like. Exactly, yeah. But you make it in the US and countries that the US has a free trade agreement with. So made in America for progressive products. Now, Starmer wants to emulate that. The difference between the UK and the US is you can't build like a car in the UK. It's based on a continental construction and manufacturing model. So what does that mean? Well, suddenly, given that that's where the world is right now, it's not really a free trade world. It's a we'll make it for us, please. That pushes you towards Europe because you can make a car in Europe and Britain is a very firm part of the construction process around Europe. So all of the geopolitical influences and all of Starmer's stated preferences push towards a much, much closer relationship with Europe, Not single market membership, not customs union membership, and not EU membership, at least for the first term, but an infinitely closer relationship than the one that we've seen over the last 5 years.
So we do all of that and then we just end up scooching back over to them.
Of course, it was always going to be that way.
Yeah.
Because it was completely insane. I mean, like, we're a medium-sized power. You know, like we're at the top of the medium size. You could maybe put us at the very bottom of the top tiers of countries, but that's what we are. And you don't get to set the rules of trade if you're a country of our size. You wield influence, as we had been doing very successfully, through the EU. We were really good at that. We gave all of that up. So now we're in the position we're in where we're going to be a rule taker until we decide to rejoin, which I think will probably happen in about 10 years.
But you say in your book that Labour Party's a mess. The infighting was quite clear from your book. And I don't want this to come across like we're saying the Conservatives are bad and, you know, the Labour side is perfect. Don't all of the same issues that you're describing around short-termism, people wanting to make an impact, not knowing what the hell's going on, and plus the infighting within Labour, isn't that all still there? Isn't that all going to be a problem?
That's exactly right. So one of the dangers for us, I think, now is that we think, oh, you change the government, everything will be fine. And it won't, because the problems are structural, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, obviously, so towards the end of a government, after a 13-year, you had the same, you know, in 97 and arguably kind of the same sort of around like 2008, 2010, but to nothing like the same extent, is you just get kind of the fag end of the human condition. Like you just get like really poor examples of humanity. Right at the top positions, you know, Chancellor, but also right down to the sort of, you know, the special advisors or the junior ministers. There was a reason they weren't given a job 13 years ago.
Is it because everyone's left? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Like basically everyone's quit and now we just got the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah, the good guys have come in, they got chucked out or they left of their own accord, and you just get people who've just been sat there on the backbenches for ages being like, well, someone please give me a job. And so finally, it's basically like I was in school being picked for the football team. You know, the only moment that's going to happen is like if everyone else is injured. And that's the exact situation that you get with governance right now. And that's how you get something like, I mean, even Sunak, if you look at him, he's not massively inept. He's just, in a sane system, he would have been a junior minister. You know, that's about the level that you would expect that guy to get to. And he's the prime minister, which gives you an indication of how badly things have gone in terms of individuals. But that's only part of the explanation. When we talk about the civil service, when we talk about legislation, when we talk about lack of long-term strategy, those are structural problems that require structural responses, big, radical proposals to fix them. And just by getting Labour in doesn't mean that they're going to go away. And actually kind of worse that actually the Tories right now are doing so badly. Like the polling today was, I mean, if you were a Tory, it would just be like being repeatedly stabbed in the face. It was horrific polling. Like there's polling by generally quite sympathetic pollsters, actually, who tend to put them higher, that was giving them about 60 MPs in the next election.
So you think we could have an even bigger problem of too much
majority?
Labour? Yeah,
like
yeah,
the size
everything.
of the majority could just be so immense.
So then they have a huge mandate as they see it. Like they can do whatever the hell they want. And
I mean, nothing can stop. No, I mean, you can barely stop someone on an 80-seat majority, as the government had before they hemorrhaged MPs through a variety of, you know, either sexual or financial scandals. But like now, if you go for a majority of what, like, you know, 200, it's just absurd. You are basically like the king of the world. Like you can do what you like. And that carries with it all sorts of the same problems that we've already seen: lack of scrutiny, lack of accountability.
do you think they're going to do good things with that?
I think governance will be better, predominantly because of their civil service background. Like Keir Starmer is a civil servant. He used to run basically a government department of prosecutions. He's essentially a permanent secretary. Sue Gray, who he put in as his chief of staff, is a former civil servant. She's spent ages right next to the cabinet secretary, that really senior position. You look at the people like even writing the manifesto, the policy leads, the foreign policy leads, people like Munira Lula, over and over again, you see civil servants. In fact, if you look at the partners of people in Labour, like Rachel Reeves, the shadow chancellor, her husband is also a civil servant. Like it is basically kind of a civil service government that's about to happen. So they'll be much better at the act of governance. But I don't think they'll reform any of these key areas that really need fixing.
And when you say governance, can you just add some context to that? What do you think we'll see improve?
Brilliant, yeah. So like, for instance, when I talk about the levers, like, you know, the prime ministers in Downing Street, they want shorter NHS waiting times and they pull a lever and what happens? You know, either something or nothing. Is a good communication with the Department of Health? Are the Treasury on board with where they need to put money? Have you got someone coming up with viable benchmarks for what you're trying to achieve and making sure that you're insulated against the distraction of daily political firefighting? That's pulling the lever and making sure something comes out at the end. We've just had at least 5, really, frankly, more like 8 years of people pulling levers and nothing happening. I think when Labour get in there, they'll come up with a much more rational strategy in Downing Street. So they're already talking about basically replacing cabinet and getting a quad system of just 4 people delivering a project, trying to make sure that day by day in a really boring way, you're fulfilling the things that you said that you were going to do. So we will probably see improvements in the NHS. The thing that really handicaps the Labour response is money. That they're not going to have any money, and that they've written themselves into a corner by saying we're not going to borrow any money and we're not going to put up any taxes. And as soon as you do that, you are basically a poverty-stricken government. That is what you're going to be. So that is a massive, massive problem for them. And they're likely to focus on areas like planning, like labour markets, which you can kind of do for free. You know what I mean? You can change the planning system. It doesn't actually cost you any money to do that. You can fix unregulated kind of 0 hours labour markets. It doesn't really cost you any money to do that. Those are the areas where we're going to see much more radical action.
Yeah, because bringing down waiting times in the NHS is costly, right? That would be something that would be expensive.
Well, the thing is, you can also do that by managing the resources and by having a really thorough plan. You know, delivering on long-term aims by short-term benchmarks. You know, you can do that for less money. I mean, you can massively rationalize the system. So, I mean, your problems, for instance, are like, if you have a heart attack in a kitchen and no ambulance comes for 8 hours, why did that happen? Okay, it happened because the ambulance that should have been coming to get you picked up someone else, and it went to the A&E, and it couldn't deposit or discharge that patient onto A&E because it was full. And why was A&E full? Because there were people using up all the beds on the wards. Why are all the beds in the wards full? Because they're unable to discharge people into social care. So the NHS is kind of this massively complex web of relations in a health service that goes from social care on the one hand to someone having a heart attack in their kitchen on the other. Now, if you're going to fix that, yes, there's money there, but also, to be fair, both parties have promised a moderate increase in funding for the NHS. But the problem also has to be about being able to look at that on a systems level, recognize the complexity, and working towards your goals day by day. And on that front, a Keir Starmer, it's not really a Labour Tory thing, it's more of a Keir Starmer versus Boris Johnson as a personality type. Keir Starmer administration is very likely to be more effective at that than the ones that we've seen recently.
If like Labour improve the train waiting times, improve the NHS, and make things like, you know, fix some potholes, I think most people will be like, yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? I think
agree.
people will be like, oh, it feels a little bit better in this place.
I agree. The thing that I don't know about is how much patience they'll have. Like when you look back to sort of the stuff around the Blair's first term, it took like 4 years before things even remotely started to improve. And we're in a worse situation now than we were there. So I agree. I think what they'll say to themselves is, as long as things are improving by the time we get to the next election, 2030, which seems like a really long time away, then we're going to be all right. But in the meantime, I can imagine people running out of patience with Labour pretty quickly unless they see improvements, and they're not going to. It's going to be a
see it
while.
happening because, you know, they seem to, their whole thing is like, we're not them. And I think people want strong leadership. They want someone to be like, we've got a plan and this is what it is. And
yes.
the Labour message seems to lack that a bit. And also the one initiative they bring forward, they've now said, oh yeah, we're not going to do that.
Yeah,
and they're
the
saying
28
it's
billion,
going to take a while. We've not got much money. They seem to be teeing it up for that, you know, like what you're saying.
Because they're terrified of the Tory attack. And that has led them to come up with an extremely conservative fiscal policy that they don't really need to have. Like, you can afford to be much more daring when it comes to borrowing to invest than Labour are right now. Like, it's not crazy economics at all. It's just basic centre, kind of not even really centre-left economics. It's just basic centre economics. And they can afford to be more daring as well on taxes. I mean, the problem really with taxes is that no politician in any of the parties is prepared to say the actual truth, which is that you have 2 choices in life. Like, you can have American public services and American levels of taxation, or you can have European public services and European levels of taxation. But if you want to have the European levels of taxation, I beg your pardon, the public services, you really do have to pay more tax. And since Thatcher, at least, we have not been prepared to have an adult conversation about tax in this country. We keep on acting like everything's going to improve, health service, education, whatever. But every time you hear from us about economics, we're going to be cutting taxes. And these 2 things cannot be true at the same time. We need to have an adult conversation about it. I'm sorry to say that Labour isn't the party that's going to start that one. And certainly none of the parties that have come beforehand have either.
No, well, I was doing some research on tax recently and some of the traps that exist and just how ridiculously complicated the system is. And there was a time where Labour promised not to increase income taxes. So they jacked up NI when they came in.
Exactly.
It's like NI is just a second income tax, really. It should be merged for simplicity. There's a lot of arguments as to why it would just remove a lot of administration for everyone. But it's politically suitable to have this other lever that they can pull, to use your term, that isn't understood. Because when I ask someone in the street, what's your tax rate? They go 20%, 40%. They don't whack on the NI.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you know what I mean? So, like you say, the tax system is complicated and it suits politics, and there's no adult conversation there. Like inheritance tax, there's no adult conversation about inheritance tax. They just use it as a political tool.
I mean, there's a point where Ed Balls and Gordon Brown are chatting because they know they have to raise tax somewhere. Someone mentions VAT and they're like, no, that's never going to work. And then they mention income tax and they're like, that doesn't work because it's really unpopular. But when they mentioned raising national insurance, most of the public at that point thought that meant they got more stuff.
Patriotic. They're like, that pays for the NHS and pensions.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's
I mean, they thought it was if you started talking about cutting national insurance, the public thought that they were losing something at that stage. Like it was actually a damaging towards them. It's just, the words national insurance have just been poisonously good branding. Yeah. It's done a lot of damage how good that branding is. It's a bit like Greenbelt. Greenbelt is really good branding and it's completely ruined us as a country. So it means we don't build anything in areas that are not that green. Yeah. So over and over again, you get that problem. I think now that's changed with national insurance. I get the sense that people kind of do recognize what it means and its implications, but yeah, I think so.
Yeah, like there is no pot for state pension. It's a Ponzi scheme, essentially. Like national insurance is not like funding this thing. It's all
there is no pot anywhere. Yeah, it's just a tax. That is what it is. It is a tax. In general, like you saw it with our last budget, of like the budget is the most insane conceivable way to pass tax policy. Just, it's madness. Like you should pass policy in any normal way just by doing a ministerial statement or publishing legislation. And we talk about it like we would talk anything else. Instead, we turn it into this bizarre act of theatre where, the Chancellor comes out now twice a year. So it's double the problem that we had when he was just doing it once a year. There's all of this political pressure on him, really acute political pressure for the party, but also for his own personal political advancement. And out of that situation, you create a tax system. It's just like an incredible way to go about things. And that's where you get your insanely complex, where you have a marginal rate that once you earn over 50,000 spikes into infinity and then goes down, and then you earn 100,000, it goes up. But if you're paying 130,000, you're paying less than someone is paying. It just makes no sense. And it doesn't even make no sense in a purposeful ideological way. It is literally not the result of anyone sitting down and asking themselves, what is this system for? And what is it trying to achieve? For a long time in my life, I would sit and like when your sort of tax statement comes in, I would just sort of look and just be like, am I just like adulting very badly? But I just can't make head or tail of this. It's so impenetrable. And then I realized this is not my fault. It's their fault. It's always the same realization I come to in my life. It's not my fault. Someone else did it, but it really is their fault. It's too complex.
Can they not reform the tax system or just simplify it? Is that if the Labour came and said, we're going to fix the taxes in the UK and make it a lot more simple, wouldn't everyone be like, yeah, that's a great idea?
No one has the bravery for that.
I'll do it. I'll step up, guys.
Why can't politicians be brave?
Look, I'm not going to lie. I'm going to be straight up about this. There would be, if I was in that position, I'm not sure that I would either. Because you just think like, there's only two ways to do it, because you're going to have to change all the imagine what happened to Theresa May, right, with the social care tax during the 2017 election, where she just basically bottomed out. Like her whole campaign fell apart on the basis of that one tax. And you see that over and over again. Same thing happened to Gordon Brown when he talked about getting rid of the basic rate on income tax. It can destroy you. And what you're going to have to do is change everything to a certain extent all at once, from council tax to income to derivatives to assets. And there's going to be a lot of losers. There's going to be winners too, right? Especially on council tax. And most of the time you think like that person deserves to win. Like that council tax is an obscene tax at the moment, given how dated it is, how archaic the basis is that we evaluate it. But the people that lose are going to scream loudest. And that is going to be a political nightmare. The only two ways of doing it is by trying to balance the losses and the wins. But that's going to be so complex that it'll probably blow up in your face, or by just reducing the overall tax yield. That's probably the most realistic way to do it while you simplify the system. But no government comes into it, especially not like a new Labour government in the middle of stagnation and inflation goes, we're going to reduce the overall tax yield to simplify things. When
won't. You've got a 200 seat majority, that is the time to do it. Isn't it? When you've got the most credit, or whatever built up, that's when you be brave.
But also you think like for a Labour person, The funny thing is, I believe in tax simplification. I'm basically classic London lefty. But for most Labour people, their heart, if you think, what are we going to try and do with this brief flicker of a moment that comes every sort of 15, 30 years? It's not tax simplification. That's not what it is.
Yeah.
That's just not what it is.
What is it then?
Usually it's going to be like giving people a head start in marginalised and forgotten communities. And that's, I think, the kind of thing that they're going to do pretty well. Like, I think the Labour policy that they have, Labour market policy, it's really strong. Like, it's a good policy. That's basically where the action is. But to be honest, like I say, on the finances, they're going to have a really hard time, partly because the government, because the country has no money, and partly because they've decided that they're not going to give themselves any extra money through borrowing or taxes.
Are you certain that Labour are going to win?
Yeah, 100%.
Well, why are you so certain?
The numbers. It's the numbers.
Okay. Yeah.
So for a start, you usually see change by now. I will 100% say this. I expect the polls to narrow from where they are now.
Yeah.
Okay, and they're currently looking at like an average 24-point lead for the Labour Party. I would expect them to narrow. And you look at, if you look at, for instance, YouGov versus Savanta polling, you see different results. It can go from like 24 to 13-point Labour lead, depending on the extent to which you ask undecided voters how else they might vote. So there's stuff there. The trouble is, even if Labour's got a 13-point lead, the Conservatives are completely buggered. Like at this point, we would expect things to narrow. They are not narrowing. Seen Tories on 20%. That is so bizarre. So like a year ago, I would go and do speeches and things, and I'll just try and push this case, especially to like business people, and just be like, I'm telling you, Labour is going to win, and you need to start preparing for that and seeing where you can operate and blah, blah, blah. Now I feel like people have got the kind of message loud and clear that Labour's going to win. What I don't think they've comprehended is just the scale of what we're looking at in the polling, like the biblical level of what we're discussing. I'm not saying this is going to happen because something must change. But if you look at the polling released this morning, you are looking at double digits MPs, Tory MPs in the Commons. Like literally 50, 60, 70 MPs. Like that is an insane place to be. And people like me, commentators, and all of us say the same thing. We're all like, it'll change, it'll narrow, this can't happen. But we should also remember two things. At the moment, the data points towards that being the outcome. And number two, that we've spent a lot of the last few years, whether it's Brexit or Trump or whatever else, going, that can't happen, that can't happen, that can't happen. And then the thing does happen. So actually it can. And at the moment, the data points towards the fact that it really could.
Yeah, and anecdotally, which I know doesn't mean much, but I think it is important to like speak to people on the ground as well. I'm getting a haircut off my barber, and he's like, I've never voted before, but I'm going to vote Labour this time.
Oh, Christ.
And I think there's like this kind of mass movement among the younger generation to probably, I reckon we'll see a lot more younger people voting than we have before, which has traditionally been an issue, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Younger people don't vote, and maybe they would be more left, and they're not represented. How long do you think it will last for this? So people are talking about, the Conservatives are dead for a generation and all of this. And do you think that's the case? Or do you think 4 years' time they could be right back again?
There's basically two ways of looking at that, right? I mean, the first thing is publics are extremely volatile at the moment. None of this should be happening. Like, you shouldn't be able to have like an 80-seat majority in 2019 and then be looking at the kind of numbers that I'm talking about here just 4 or 5 years later. That just typically doesn't happen. The public's really volatile. They've lost their traditional sense of loyalty towards the parties, which is part of the reason that Boris Johnson could win those Labour seats, in the Red Wall. That was never possible before because you just have people that always voted the way their parents did. And now people are much more almost consumers, like they make a judgment themselves. So that makes everything much harder to predict. The weird thing that we're seeing though is the way that the young behave, and not even really the young. Like there's no group under the age of 65 where the Tories have majority support. It's basically only the over 65s that are still Tory. Why is this happening? For a reason that is basically quite intimately connected to what you guys do here. Just that it's really hard to have capitalist voters when they don't have any capital.
They've got no assets.
Exactly.
Yeah, you need people, once they buy a house, they go right because they want to protect it, right?
They've got something to preserve.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wealth.
If they don't have that, and look, a lot of millennials and Gen Z will inherit their parents' home. Part of the delayed reaction that we have to that is the fact that because people live so much longer now, they actually haven't started inheriting, at the millennial level. Yeah. So, but once that starts happening, maybe they'll have more of a thing to protect because they'll get the stuff from their parents. They won't be earning that money themselves, right? It'll be that. But nevertheless, that is a fundamental change to what we saw before. Before, we would see people move into the Conservative support in their 30s, their 40s, their 50s, because they're becoming more successful. They had an asset. Now they don't. So therefore, they're actually much more immune to a conservative economic message. And then when things talk about culture war debates about statues, about race, about gender, about sexuality, blah, 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 that's very different. People don't change with age. Your cultural views as a human being tend to be set at about 18. And at that point, they kind of stay the same until you're 70 years old. So, someone that's 70 years old now would have been, obviously like in the 60s, part of the hippie thing, would have had views about it's okay to divorce and blah, blah, blah. That's the view they have now in their 70s, right? If we went back 40 years, people in their 70s would have been like, it is not okay to divorce, a view that you kind of never hear now. If you have a cultural view on liberal issues, basically, you will keep that view from the age of 18 onwards. And so on that part, the Conservatives are also alienating younger voters. So in the long term, when you look at Conservative support, the thing to give them hope is that it's much more elastic, it's much more volatile, voters change. But in terms of the structure, both economically and on cultural politics, the Tories look like they're really in quite a severe degree of bother.
And like you talk about this, this conversation is about how they don't know what they're doing. And maybe one core fundamental thing of like the Conservatives was they knew what they were doing with the economy. And Liz Truss probably shattered that in a second, didn't they? This like, oh God, these guys really don't know what they're doing.
Which is kind of ironic because it's not even really like, they showed that they didn't know what they were doing with the Brexit ordeal, which is just like, and again, you could even be for Brexit, but the manner in which they were doing it and the degree of kind of, at best, naivety and at worst, like willful ignorance of the consequences of their policies, when it came to especially the border, you were just like, if you care about small businesses in Britain, you will not do this. You know what I mean? You will think more deeply. So actually, they'd already shown how catastrophically inept they were with economic matters. Then Truss comes along. Truss was really bad. I mean, obviously bad. But lots of the things that the government's currently blamed for are blamed on basically by virtue of Truss. And it's not really fair. Like when it comes to like a lot of inflation, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, lots of these issues, these are massive issues that would have happened no matter how competent the person was. Yeah. So it's a sort of weird fairy story where they got away with way too much before Truss. And now I sort of feel like they're blamed for too much after her. But nevertheless, the sum result is you get a Liz Truss moment. It's a big primary colour EastEnders moment. Everyone clocks it. They get a narrative from that, and the narrative are they don't know what they're doing with the economy. They've cocked it up. And then all of the economic experiences that they have, the price of soup in the supermarket, gets hooked onto that narrative, the Liz Truss, their responsible narrative. And at that point, that is game over. If there's a big narrative event like that the public actually paid attention to, that they can immediately comprehend, that their individual financial woes are interpreted through that event, you are absolutely game over. And it's not going to change until after you've been defeated at a general election.
And you'll fast forward 40 years and you'll have like an older person sat there going, I don't vote Conservative because they don't know what they're doing with the economy.
Maybe.
Because Liz Truss is a lettuce.
She's a dry lunch.
Yeah. Do you think then, okay, to finish this off, because at points you've said you've openly said you don't think anyone knows what they're doing. Do you think there's reason to be optimistic about the future of the UK, its political system, and the direction that we're heading in? That's a no. See you later, guys. See you next week as we track the country burning.
I want to be optimistic, and my natural disposition is optimism. I think that things to a certain extent will improve under Labour, as I outlined. But the truth is, and just basic competence in governance as individuals. But the truth is that they have set themselves some really severe traps, and the state of the country economically is really, really very bad indeed. We'll need a mixture of luck and skill to get us out of it. So things are going to get better after the election. Whether they can get better to the extent that I could actually act like an optimistic person, I'm not so sure about that.
Thank you so much for making it to the end of the episode. We did cover a lot of ground there, so if you want a summary of everything, we write a newsletter. It's really good. You can sign up below in the description.
And if you enjoyed this episode, trust me, you're going to love this one.